मैं एक क्लासिफिकेशन जो मौलाना अशरफ अली थानवी ने इस्तेमाल की थी उसके मुतालिक मैं बात करना चाहूँगा, जिसमें उन्होंने दीन को, एक तो उनकी बेसिक एक क्रिटिक थी कि आजकल के ज़माने में हम दीन क्या होता है उसको लोग भूल चुके हैं। तो मौलाना थानवी ने दीन को 5 डिफरेंट कैटेगरीज कह सकते हैं, कैटेगरीज में तकसीम किया, और जिसमें आ जाते हैं अकायद, इबादात जिनको दिन्यात भी कहा जा सकता है, उसके मगर इन चीज़ों के अलावा मुआशरात, मुआमलात और अखलाक, तो इसको अगर अपने ज़माने में हम अप्लाई करें जो एक्चुअली मौलाना थानवी कर रहे थे, तो एक मॉडर्निटी से इसका बहुत ज़्यादा ताल्लुक है कि हम दीन को किस तरह से देखते हैं, आपको बाद में। तो एनीवेज, तो ये जो 5 डिविजन्स हैं, अकायद, दियानात या इबादात, मुआमलात, मुआशरात और अखलाक, इनको इंग्लिश में आप जस्ट ट्रांसलेट कर सकते हैं, यू कैन इनटू बिलीफ्स, practices, religious duties. So Aqaid, basic definition of that would be beliefs. Diyanat, the basic definition would be religious duties or practices. You can also call them ibadat. Muamilat would be trade, other business and business transactions, but Maulana generally extends that to mean broader things, including, say, political transactions, any other kinds of transactions and interactions, even on a. Then there's muashrat, which he translates as social interaction, or can be translated as social interactions or social etiquette, and akhlaq, which one can translate as virtue or ethics. So I just want to go over these different dimensions and see how actually they're all tied together. In a kind of an ideal situation, all 5 of these carry weight and equal, not necessarily equal weight, but important weight in individual and social life. And they're integrated together for a common purpose. Common purpose, common maqsad, so, and that which is to enable human beings to fulfill their highest destiny, which is conformity with God, with Allah Ta'ala, or Iman says with the good pleasure of God. And that ultimately, of course, is conformity with our own highest nature, in the way the fitrah that Allah Ta'ala has made us in. So the purpose of deen is to therefore enable this common purpose, this fulfillment of this of humankind's highest destiny. And for that, all of these different dimensions are ultimately necessary on an individual and social level, and not only just what we oftentimes, as I was saying in the beginning, think of religion as, or deen, if you want to translate that as religion, as just some beliefs and some practices that you do every day, namaz, roza, and so on. So one of the critiques that Maulana Thanvi makes in a number of his works, I could tell you if anybody was interested, some of them, but was that there is, in the modern experience after colonization, I think you all took a class on modernity and so forth last session, yeah, and so the colonial, Maulana Thanvi locates in the colonial experience of modernization and the modernity, colonization, sorry, and the modernization that it brought, um, the cause of South Asians not being able to appreciate um, religion in the vaster sense, or deen in this vaster sense of the term. He argued, for example, that the British introduction of modern education particularly cut South Asians that had this modern education. Of course, our current education is mostly a comes from the British education. It's just a variant on it. We've developed it from that kind of basis. It's not a traditional Islamic education, which hopefully you're getting a little bit here in at Hastoneest. So by through this experience of colonial modernity, Muslims in South Asia were therefore came to think of religion in a very strongly modern way, which was that religion was mainly about beliefs. And I mean, I could talk a lot more about that, but generally the idea in the Western understanding of religion is religion being about beliefs is largely inherited from the Christian tradition, which more than any other tradition talks about belief as as the central dimension in religion. It's as belief as kind of defining religion, and not so much actions. So the idea in Christianity was always that being religious really meant having this particular belief in Jesus, for example. And that, even though the West secularized, that particular perspective remained with wherever kind of a Western understanding of religion was introduced. So that might have been part of it. Part of it was just that modernization meant that a lot of dimensions of human life became increasingly secularized, so that what would ordinarily be a part of what religion covered, for example, social life, or one's kind of professional life, even one's habits and thoughts and kind of psychological life in some ways, became other sources or non-religious kind of or a secular kind of framework became the norm for these other or these dimensions of life, so social life and business transactions and so on. So when Maulana Thanvi is kind of reintroducing this five-part usage of what religion or deen is, he's also not coming up with something new. This is found in the Sharia, generally in older works, that deen has different components. And ultimately, of course, this goes back to the Hadith Gabriel that some of you might know. If you don't, so I mean, if you raise your hand, are you familiar with Hadith Gabriel? So Hadith Gabriel is a very a particularly powerful and very interesting hadith, which many Muslim scholars have thought of as kind of defining what religion is, as kind of defining in very clear terms what religion is, and particularly what parts religion or Islam in particular have. All right, so I'll read out this hadith, and then we can relate it to this larger discussion of when we're talking about religion, to be able to see the different dimensions of it and the way that those dimensions are to be found in the original sources in the Quran, and particularly in this hadith, and later on as how Muslim scholars developed these and applied the different dimensions to different aspects of human existence, right? So the hadith begins that it lays out a time that the Prophet ﷺ is sitting with his companions in, I think perhaps it was the masjid, right? So, and they're sitting in Medina. So I'll just narrate the hadith part by part. So the hadith goes, Umar ibn al-Khattab said, one day we were with God's messenger. One day when we were with God's messenger, a man with very white clothing and very black hair came up to us. No mark of travel was visible on him, and none of us recognized him. Sitting down before the Prophet, leaning his knees against his, and placing his hands on his thighs, he said, "Tell me, Muhammad, about submission." The Prophet ﷺ replied, submission, this is the word for submission, is Islam here in the Arabic. Islam or submission means that you should bear witness that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is God's messenger. That you should perform the ritual prayer, salah, pay the alms tax, zakat, fast during Ramadan, Sawm, and make the pilgrimage to the house, Hajj, if you are able to go there. The man, this man in white clothing, said, "You have spoken the truth." Now this is Hazrat Umar talking. We were surprised at his questioning him and then declaring that he had spoken the truth. So it already kind of lays out a very interesting scenario in which the Prophet ﷺ is sitting with his companions, and this is Medina. There is no there's no rail service coming to the door. You can't fly in there like today. So if a man comes to the town, it's not a very big town, right? So if a person comes to visit the town, the fact that he has to travel through the desert, he shouldn't be wearing completely white clothing with no dirt on him, no dust on him. You have to travel for several days to get to Medina, and so the companions are really surprised at who is this person. No one recognizes him. Another thing, of course, is in those days is that when you enter a new place, you should really know someone that you stay with. Arabia is a very tribal society at this time. So generally for protection and other reasons, you would already know someone if you were traveling. And it's a small enough place, everybody would know that you're there. So there's something mysterious about this person, very, very mysterious, right? So, and the other thing is that, obviously Hazrat Umar and other people are really surprised that, this person is sitting knee to knee. This is very, shows a great intimacy between him and the, only, you would do that with your best friend or something like that. So how dare he, go up to the Prophet and sit with him like that. And thirdly, he asked the Prophet a question, and his response, he said, "No, you have spoken the truth." He's corroborating him. He's saying shabash, So how dare who is this person? Why is he talking like this? So so he asks him. So he asks him here, what is Islam, right? So the next question he asks him is, he says to the Prophet ﷺ, "Now tell me about faith, about Iman." The Prophet ﷺ replied, "Iman or faith means that you have faith in God, His angels, His books, His messengers, and the last day, and that you have faith in the measuring out, in qadr, both its good and its evil." So again, the person remarks that he had spoken the truth, and he then says, again, the people are surprised at, at the audacity of this questioner. And he finally asks him, now tell me, what is Ihsan? And the Prophet ﷺ replies that Ihsan, or this can be translated, as virtue, as beauty, doing what is beautiful, sometimes even as excellence, because Hasan in Arabic, the term means both goodness and beauty. He replied, doing what is beautiful means that you should worship God as if you see him. For even if you do not see him, he nonetheless sees you. So it's a very, again, a beautiful hadith. And we can go over these three answers of the Prophet ﷺ to the questioner in a second once we finish the story. But remember, these three things are what? Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. These are the three things that the questioner asks, and the three responses that the Prophet ﷺ gives him, and we'll come back to that. So I'll skip the next part of the hadith, in which is about the Day of Judgment and so forth. You can look it up. It's the Hadith Gabriel if you want to read the full hadith. So we'll just move down to the end part of the hadith, which states, then the man went away after asking him these questions. And this is, again, remember, Hazrat Umar is narrating this. So after I waited for a long time, the Prophet ﷺ said to me, do you know who the questioner was, Umar? I replied, God and his messenger know best. He said, he was Gabriel, Jibreel, Hazrat Jibreel, the angel. He came to teach you your religion. So, it's so that that's that solves the mystery. That, of course, shows the power of this hadith, because it's perhaps the only time that the other companions, other people with the Prophet ﷺ actually saw Hazrat Jibreel. It was not something that was a common occurrence at all. He only generally came to the Prophet himself, and not his companions. So this also shows us the kind of significance of this particular hadith. This must be something very important about it, that the angel appears to the whole community instead of the Prophet only. All right, so the three components of this that are mentioned in this hadith are what? So, maybe if I can get, I know you've had lots of classes already, so but audience participation. What's the first one?
Islam.
Islam. All right. The other person, what's the second?
Iman and Ihsan.
Okay, good. Yeah. So these three parts can be really seen as the kind of how a divine way of this comes from the angel, and so way of dividing or classifying the different dimensions of the religion, of what religion involves. So the first dimension is Islam. One can say this Islam with a, if you're writing in English, with a small I, right? Islam in its original philological, in its linguistic meaning, which is a submission or surrender to God, right? So, and how does the Prophet define this? What is Islam? He defines it through mentioning the five arkan, right? The five pillars. He mentions that it is doing these five things. So, testifying that La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, giving zakah, offering salah, fasting in Ramadan, and going on Hajj. So, all right, so we have this dimension. The next dimension is Iman. In that, the Prophet says, Iman is having faith, having conviction, having belief in 6 things. So, these things are God, there's angels, his scriptures, books, prophets and messengers, in the last day, in Qiyamah, and in Qadr, right? So that everything ultimately comes from God, whether it's good, bad, however you might experience it. That God is ultimately behind. Allah Ta'ala is behind all things. All right. So, what do you see as the difference between Islam and Iman? What kinds of, you know, having Islam versus having Iman? How is that different from each other? And so, again, anybody in the audience or online?
Probably Islam is a much shallower interpretation of the whole tradition, and Iman would be a much deeper interpretation, more encompassing, something that uh, that is much deeper than just the visible things that one. You can say that Iman is actually, you can say it's the spirit behind the pillars of why you have to do this, that sort of thing.
All right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great point. That there's kind of a deepening happening here with each of these three, right? So, once you start Islam, it is the maybe shallow is too strong a word, but it's a more kind of external kind of thing, things that you are uh, one could say is kind of the basic. It's a basic level. It's the things that you do in order to be classified a Muslim. But what kinds of things are they? If anyone wants to add, how are these two different? Maybe one more observation. So what you said was, very good. I was thinking even in a more basic way, and we'll come back to that. But what is the difference between uh, Islam and Iman, the way that it's defined here?
One way we can say is Islam is the dogma, is the tenets, is the knowledge itself, is the ilm al-yaqeen, in other words, and the Iman is about having certainty, or in other words, it's the ain al-yaqeen, having faith. It's Iman is really believing, not just with your
Knowledge.
accepting it. No, it's not just accepting it, but it's actually embracing it because you've experienced it directly.
Okay, great. Yeah, your answers are. Sometimes I often teach this to American students here. So
I want to give an answer.
oh, sorry. Are you?
Yeah, I'm Aisha.
Oh, yes,
I
yes,
have an answer for your
yes,
question.
yes. Yeah.
Iman is your personal thing, like what you believe, what
Yeah.
is your faith in. ये जैसे नमाज है, रोजा है, ज़कात है, हज आपके ज़ाती मामलात हैं जो आपके इनसाइड है, कोर है जो आपका। तो जो इस्लाम है वो आपके मामलात हैं, जो आपके मुआशरत है, जो आपकी इकोनॉमिकल आपकी डीलिंग्स हैं लोगों के साथ, जो आपका जिसको एक तरीके से हम हकूक़ुल्लाह और हकूक़ुल इबाद उनको दो हम उनकी अपनी आसानी दो ग्रोहों में कर सकते हैं कि एक बहुत बड़ा जैसे जो है हकूक एस्पेक्ट है तो बेसिकली इस्लाम मीन्स कि आप सलामती और सेफ्टी दे रहे हैं कि मुसलमान वो है जिसके हाथ और जबान से दूसरे मुसलमान महफूज रहें।
जी, very good. All these answers are great, and so they cover various
कि आप
facets.
दूसरे इंसानों के लिए कैसे हैं, शर पहुंचा रहे हैं उनको या फायदा पहुंचा रहे हैं।
जी, thank you. Yeah, so also the answer that जो आपने दिया इल्म यकीन और आइन यकीन वो एक मतलब ज़्यादा हायर लेवल है। मुझे ख्याल आप यहाँ पे मैं उस वक्त कहने वाला था कि मैं आमतौर पे अमेरिकन स्टूडेंट्स को पढ़ाता हूँ, तो उनका मतलब उनको हक़ल यकीन और आइन यकीन और इल्म यकीन और इस किस्म की डिस्टिंक्शंस तो पहली बार पे मैं सुन रहा हूँ, बट दैट्स ग्रेट। मतलब आप मेरा ख्याल है यहाँ पे आपने और भी चीज़ें सीखी हैं, उनको आप relate करें, but that was good observation. Both that's true.
जी, Hastoneest का करिश्मा है।
जी हाँ तो एक मोर बेसिक वे इसको इस तरह भी देखा जा सकता है, और जो आप ऑनलाइन जो कह रही थी, मुझे नहीं पता आप लोग सुन सके कि नहीं। तो वो कि एक इस्लाम जो है वो एक इट्स वो बाद में मैं मामलात मुआशरात वगैरह से इसे रिलेट करूंगा, मगर इस्लाम बेसिकली एक्शन से रिलेटेड, इट्स अ फॉर्म ऑफ एक्शन, राइट? एवरीथिंग दैट यू आर डूइंग, it's about doing, right? So the when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam answers that question, he says, do these things. Islam is about doing things with your body, physically doing things. It's
But it's also about
accomplishing.
saying, it's also about accepting oneness of God and the prophets, and believing the. So it has that asul deen as well. It has those beliefs. Aqaid भी हैं इसके अंदर, लेकिन अकायद का सिर्फ जो है वो उसको उनको accept करना with the tongue, you can say, or
Actually,
formally accept करना. But it's not about internalizing those very concepts. So that
इसलिए कि आप नोटिस करेंगे एक्चुअली इस पे ये नहीं है कि अकायद को आप में यकीन वाला डायमेंशन नहीं है, मतलब इन द सेंस से ये एक बेसिक जो डेफिनेशन है इस्लाम की हदीस के थ्रू, वो ये कि आपने टेस्टिफाई करना, आपने मतलब आप जब मुसलमान जैसे इस्लाम कोई कबूल करता है तो वो बस कहता है अशहदु अन ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह व अशहदु अन्ना मुहम्मदन अब्दुहु व रसूलुहु। तो इतना अगर आप कहते हैं, अंदर से तो किसी को कोई नहीं पता कि क्या है, तो that basically makes you a Muslim, right? So action है, that's a kind of action. तो मतलब of course it includes belief, मगर it's action which shows that you believe. Mगर it also relates to another verse, for example, in the Quran, that says that about the Bedouins, that again I forget exactly where this verse is, if anybody remembers, that say to say I'm trying to think it. I'll paraphrase, but it basically the idea is that the Bedouins say that we believe, and the Quran says, don't say that you believe, just say that you submit, for faith has not yet entered your heart. That you're Muslim, but you're not mu'min. Iman, you don't have Iman. You're Muslim, you've said all these things. You do the roza and namaz and so forth, and you say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, but you still have not reached the level of Iman. So it's kind of, that's one of the Quranic roots for this distinction. So so all of the distinction everyone said, all they all make sense. So if Islam is actions, then Iman has to then do with conviction, with belief, right? So a lot of times in modern language, when we say belief, Urdu इतना मसला नहीं है, इसलिए अब यकीन जैसे उससे हम रिलेट करते हैं आज को, या इंग्लिश में जब से belief or faith, उसका आमतौर पे मतलब becomes very highly influenced by modern kind of distinction between things like blind faith and a kind of secular perspective in which belief and faith seem like that they're not based on anything solid, that they're not based on an intellectual process. But Iman,
it's like something you can't explain. Belief becomes something that you can't explain. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's something
you can't have rational for.
Yeah, you just kind of have it because you have, it's what you were taught, or you just feel it on a personal level or something like that. Well, in the Islamic tradition, Iman was always something that you came to through an intellectual process that resulted in yaqeen, in some kind of conviction in something, right? So even in the Quran, it's not just, in fact, the polytheists are criticized for believing in whatever their ancestors were saying, whatever their forefathers were saying, and they were told, just reflect, look at the heavens, the earth, look at the world, look at yourselves, and reflect on those things, and you would come to this conclusion that there's a God, that He made you that there is accountability for human actions, that you are on purpose in this world. and so on. So these dimensions that are mentioned in Iman. So Iman again, is having faith in Iman in that there's God, that Allah Ta'ala, that there are angels, that there are scriptures that God sends down, that there are messengers and prophets that He sends to guide humanity, that there's the last day, which ultimately the importance of Qiyamah is that, at least on one level, it's about accountability, right? It's about that you're not going to be able to just kind of get away with it, whatever you do, and that's how the Quran oftentimes talks about the Day of Judgment. And finally, the idea of Qadr. So these are all things that you believe in. You have a kind of conviction with. So you believe this with, in the way that Iman you perform with. I mean, Islam you perform through your physical self, right? So this is more your intellectual self, or your one could say it's your mind or your intellect that it deals with. So in order to understand all of these things, you have to employ your intellect. And in order to come to these convictions of faith in these, you have to, again, deploy your intellect. The third dimension, which is Ihsan, is if you worship God as if you see Him. For even if you do not see Him, He sees you. What might that dimension be? Again, audience or if the first dimension is kind of the way I'm defining it is about action. It's about doing things in the world. The second is a more internal thing, in the sense that mentally, rationally intellectually understanding what Deed is talking about, all these different dimensions, particularly the more metaphysical dimensions of human existence. So what would Ihsan be? Worshipping God as if you see Him, or even if you do not see Him, He nonetheless sees you. How would you contrast that with the other two?
Probably it's righteousness, taqwa.
So taqwa definitely could be is a part of it.
One way we can say that is
अल्लाह की इबादत के जो हैं वो 3 दर्जात हैं। एक ज़ाहिरी और जिस्मानी इबादत है, एक रूहानी इबादत है, और एक जो लोगों के साथ मुआमलात की इबादत है। अगर हम नमाज पढ़ते हैं, एक साफ उसका जो बज़ाहिर मतलब है वो तो यही है कि इस यकीन के साथ नमाज अदा करें कि अल्लाह हमें देख रहा है, गो के हम उसको नहीं देख रहे। मगर अगर हम नमाज अच्छे तरीके से अदा करते हैं, लेकिन हम अगर झूठ बोलने लगते हैं, तो उस वक्त भी हम अल्लाह को हाजिर और नाजिर जान सकें। ईमान का तकाजा तो ये है कि फिर अल्लाह हर जगह और हर वक्त मौजूद है। तो जो इबादत है वो जिस्मानी इबादत तो कर ली। अब जो रूहानी इबादत है, या जो हमारे फेली या मामलात के दुनिया के मामलात में जब हम डील कर रहे हैं, किसी के साथ धोखा कर रहे हैं या कुछ हमें मालूम है कि ये हम गलत कर रहे हैं, तो उसमें अल्लाह को हाजिर और नाजिर जान के हम ये बात करें कि नहीं, हमने फेयर एंड फाइन डील करनी है। और इसी तरह दूसरी चीज़ों के अंदर हकूक के लोगों का हक गसब करते हुए हमें मालूम है कि ये हमारा हक नहीं है, उसमें भी अल्लाह को हाजिर और नाजिर जान के कि गोया वो नहीं देख रहा, या हम कोई चोरी करने लगे हैं तो कोई देख नहीं रहा, मगर हम ये देखें कि अल्लाह तो देख रहा है, वो समी है, बसीर है, अलीम है, खबीर है, तो वो हर चीज़ और हर हरकत और हमारे दिलों के अंदर पोशीदा बातों तक से वाकिफ है। हमारी दिल के अंदर कोई बुरी या अच्छी नीयत आती है तो वो उससे भी वाकिफ है।
जी जी, थैंक यू। हाँ, तो इन्होंने जो एक बात की, रूहानी डायमेंशन जो है वो आप कह सकते हैं एहसान जो है, अगर इस्लाम एक जिस्मानी डायमेंशन से डील कर रहा है, फिजिकल वर्ल्ड से, जो ईमान है वो एक इंटेलेक्चुअल अक्ली रियलिटी से डील कर रहा है, और ये ह्यूमन इंसानों की जो रूहानी डायमेंशन है, स्पिरिचुअल जिसे कह सकते हैं, उससे ये
एक तरीका हम इसको एक तरीका शायद हम one way probably we can explain it is Islam is the proclamation of unity of God. Iman is knowing that God, unity of being, and Ihsan is doing things beautifully. Therefore,
okay, yes, Yeah, no, that's true. So I mean, so again, maybe what you're saying is similar to the idea of, yeah, Islam is about acting, about doing kind of the doing basic things, and then Iman is about belief, about um, believing, thinking, uh, and Ihsan is, yes, it's about doing things beautifully, but it's really about being, right? It's about actually embodying, deeply kind of having living these things in a batini or internal kind of way. So, for example, just another example of this would be just that you could be like the Quran says, about the Bedouins. You could be a Muslim without having a conviction in any of these things because nobody knows. You're just doing your namaz. You can maybe you don't understand what La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah means. I mean, there's also the munafiqun, right? So um, you can do all of these things without really believing in them, either because of directly you just don't believe in it, or you could just not have very deep understanding, right? You're just going through the motions. This is what you were taught. You never thought about it. Although most people are not on that level, but yeah, most Muslims, I think, are not only just doing it only on the first level. But you kind of begin with the first level. That's kind of a child. That's what they do. The second level is that you come to understand these things. You come to understand who human beings are, who God is, what is the relationship, how does God communicate with human beings, what is the purpose of human life. And the third is at the highest level that very, very few people get to. So one could say more people get to the second level, right? Many of us start reflecting on these things. Not everybody, but a third level is something that very few people get to, which is living as if you were actually witnessing God in all your life, in all your worship. Uh, it's not only worship. I mean, the Hadith says that, but from the Dini perspective, everything is worship. So it's really applies to all dimensions of life that you live as if Allah Ta'ala was present. You could see him. And even if you can see him, which there is, again, seeing him and not seeing him, that is even a kind of hierarchy within that hadith. So even if you can't see him, knowing that he's there, right? Knowing that he is present. So let me just now relate this to the classification I talked about briefly at the beginning uh, about the Maulana Thanvi uses, right? So, in which he Aqaids, Ibadat, Muamilat, Muashrat, and Akhlaq. So and he defines these in different ways. So sometimes he also calls Aqaid Tasdiqat, sometimes he calls Ibadat Amal or Diyanat, sometimes he calls Muamalat Siyasat, and sometimes he calls Muashrat Adab, which is actually probably a good definition of them. And sometimes he calls this last dimension Akhlaq as Saluk and Muqamat, which are more kind of directly Sufi terms. So, but these five dimensions relate to this hadith in the sense that the Islam is has to do with uh, ibadat mainly, but it really has to do with more than just ibadat, right? It has to do with, and I think this online person was talking about this. Sorry, forgot your name. But so that muamalat and muasharat are also part of this dimension in a certain sense, that it has to do with actions of all kinds. The second dimension, Iman, relates to the idea of uh, in Aqaid, in having the right kinds of beliefs, the right kinds of thoughts, the right kinds of convictions, thinking in the right way. And finally, Ihsan has to do with this dimension of akhlaq, or other terms he calls saluk or maqamat, of kind of the inner life, of really kind of developing one's character as well as one's relationship with God, and as well as kind of going on this journey to God in a deep uh, way. And that's why I spoke some of the Sufis terms, and Sufism as this kind of journey to God. All right, so So his criticism again is that in the modern period, in our kind of contemporary life, we have reduced religion to ibadat, mainly with some aqaid. And it has have very little to do with our muamalat. Where do we get it from? He was living in a colonial period, but things have not really changed all that much. So muamalat, we're following the international financial system in most of the time, or whatever the particular laws are of the country that we're living in. Um, and oftentimes, even if it's our Islamic countries, most of the Islamic countries, uh, there this dimension of muamalat, of different interactions between people, particularly on a professional level, business transactions, other forms of transactions that you have, which are not just kind of social, that have some kind of uh, rights and responsibilities that, which of course social ones do as well, but it's more than just adab. It is, where, responsibilities and rights that you fulfill, those kinds of transactions. So muamalat are oftentimes come from, we're getting them from all sorts of other sources, right? They're not generally rooted in Islam, or at least that's Maulana Thanvi's critique. Even more so, he said muamalat, at least ulama are aware of, generally speaking, and trying to get people, to bring these back. Maulana Thanvi said that muashrat are completely have been abandoned by everyone, in the sense that our basic social etiquette, the adab that we have, come from all sorts of sources, and they do not come from from a religious or spiritual source. That we're just basically kind of making it up as we go along, that the basics for our social interactions has, in the modern period, almost Islam has completely disappeared off of it. So, therefore, even basic adab that you should have, basic adab in all sorts of different situations, has disappeared. There's a really nice work of Maulana Thanvi, if you haven't read him, um, Adab al-Muashrat, which is directly about this, which is also sometimes very funny because he has no he doesn't hold back when some person comes to see him, talks in a way that he doesn't think is has proper adab. The way he explains that, or he corrects, so but it's so, and finally, he says the dimension of akhlaq again has generally, it has not, it's not no longer taken very seriously by Muslims of South Asia in general. So one could also say that these different dimensions have, if you can relate really all the different things that you find in Sharia, for example, to these different dimensions. Say, all of you are taking this course on, which is looking at different dimensions of Islam. Even if you look at different disciplines that developed in the course of Islamic history, whichever you look at, you can relate to one of these things in some kind of way. So, if you're thinking about ilm al-kalam, that relates directly to aqaid. Safa relates directly to aqaid. Various forms of what is sometimes called tasawwuf nazari. So, a doctrinal or theoretical Sufism. So Sufism can be of two things, right? The kind of Sufism in which you do adhkar, you do dhikr, and you have wazifas, and you do wird, and all these kinds of things. Or you follow the guidance in very practical ways of Sheikh, Murshid. That is tasawwuf amali. It's called tasawwuf amali, so practical Sufism. But doctrinal Sufism which talks about what is the nature of human existence. Things that, for example, Sheikh Ibn Arabi talks about, or within in the subcontinent of Iran, Shaulullah, Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi, other people talk about is philosophical. One can even call it philosophical Sufism. So all these things relate to Aqaid. As far as ibadat are concerned, fiqh, of course, is directly related to that, but it's not only found in books of fiqh. Fiqh kind of relates those dimensions of ibadat, which have to do with this Islam, how to do them, how to do and how not to do. But if you look at other fields, economics relates to muamilat, politics also relates to muamilat, all kind of social conduct relates to muashrat, ethics, psychology, all of those things relate to akhlaq. So I think, yeah, I mean, I can just we can open it up to, questions. And I mean, just to finish, I guess I'll just mentioning what this, if Maulana Thanvi critiqued these things, how did he think that, what should modern Muslims do, right? So in order to reintegrate or come back to a broader understanding of deen than we have nowadays. So he says, there's various, I mean, he gives very practical reasons, but, just because of shortage of time, just briefly, he says that the problem actually has to do with the fact that, one, there's just a lack of knowledge among Muslims and generally widespread ignorance about what constitutes deen. And secondly, and more problematically, there's a lack of determination or lack of will, himmat ki kami. So, so a lack of knowledge, therefore, hides one from the truth, and a lack of determination prevents practice, even if the truth is known, right? So the first problem pertains to the intelligence, and the second one to the will. And the two things that Maulana Thanvi talks about is the first, to get knowledge, right? To go to the ulama, to go to people who know something. So all of you are kind of doing this, by coming to Hastoneest in a certain sense. So the first part is increasing your knowledge, coming to really understand what deen is about, and that kind of corrects the intellectual issue that you don't know. The second one is a little bit more difficult because not having determination, not having himmat, is ultimately has to do with the nafs, and that needs a training of the nafs. And so Maulana Thanvi therefore says that that in his opinion, anybody who really wants to correct the whole situation and be at the best place should follow not only the exoteric but the esoteric, and therefore find a spiritual teacher, right? So a spiritual teacher which would help in strengthening one's himmat, one's spiritual will, and through that you would then not limit religion to just beliefs and some practices, but religion would therefore be a part of your whole life, both your inward and your outward dimension of your existence. All right. I think we can open it up to Sawal Jawab.
That was very useful. I thought so.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have a question.
There's one question here.
Okay, I have a question. Considering the current state of affairs of the Islamic world of Muslims, any organization or any institution or any revival, reformist movement, any person wants to revive Islam to its full glory or anything, where should the starting point come from? Should it come from Ihsan side towards the ritualistic form of Islam, or from ritualistic side towards the Ihsan side? Where should the starting point, where should you start? How should you convince people to, you should try to hit their internalized feelings, or from the external you try to change their internal?
So I think I would take a step back, right? I think the first thing that a lot of these kind of reform and revival movements do, and that's a great question, is that reform of the world, reform of others, needs to be preceded by reform of oneself. You have to actually know what you're doing in order to be able to tell anybody else what to do. Or you need to really be, you have some knowledge in order to tell other people what knowledge is. Or in the same way, you need to really be spiritually in a very good state in order to call other people to a spiritually good state. So again, since I was talking about Maulana Thanvi, just when Tablighi Jamaat, for example, was formed, this is not a criticism of any one group, but he had reservations because he was like, anybody can go and like say that you memorize these things and go share it. So somebody, how do we know that these people will be really prepared for sharing that? And some of the founders of Tablighi Jamaat then tried to convince Maulana Thanvi, so he ultimately had a more positive opinion, I think. Or if things were done correctly, which I don't know if they always are. So
Actually,
basically,
change comes from within, as Hazrat Ali Karamallah Wajho, he focused on solitude, as he said that वो शख्स पाक है जिसकी तन्हाई भी पाक है. So the change comes from within, and in solitude you find answers of all of your questions, and by practicing the ihsan side of your faith or iman through husne saluk or husne muashrat, क्योंकि एहसान इसका रूट वर्ड जो है वो हुस्न है कि किसी भी चीज़ को खूबसूरत, तो अल्लाह जमील है और जमाल को पसंद फरमाता है. तो जब हम ये सोचेंगे कि हर वक्त अल्लाह हमारे रूबरू, हम उसके रूबरू हैं, गोया कि हम उसको नहीं देख रहे मगर वो हमें देख रहा है, तो हम ऑटोमेटिकली ज़रा करेक्ट करके अपने आप को, अपनी ज़िंदगी को लेके चलेंगे, छोटी छोटी मामलात में भी, कि जहाँ कोई और नहीं देख सकता सिवाय हमें अल्लाह के.
जी एब्सोल्युटली, हाँ, यही मतलब बेसिक डेफिनेशन ऑफ एहसान यही मैं पहले बयान कर रहा था. तो हाँ, मतलब ऑफ कोर्स, सो yeah, change needs to begin from this place of ihsan. But दूसरी आपकी जो other part of your question is, all right, so if one has done that, right? So if one is, I think very few people can claim to be there, but if one has done some kind of reform of oneself, and then begins to, all right, tell other people, want some kind of revival, then I think that the situation in the modern world, is very variant. But you sometimes now you have to begin with things that you would never have begun with in previous times. So, for example, there might be people who just not convinced, who don't have basic kind of conviction in the dimensions of faith. So, if you're just calling people only to, for example, to do various practices, so for some people that might be great, but for other people, they need some kind of intellectual certainty. And for that, you would have to, some kind of revival would need to include the intellectual dimension to address those people for whom they, in order to do the practices and the spiritual development, they need first to be fully convinced. They need to mentally understand. And nowadays, we are living in a very rational kind of age. So people really need to come to and there's a lot of doubts. There's a lot of alternative ways of seeing the world. So one needs to kind of address that dimension very strongly in any kind of revivalist or reformist endeavor.
So does that mean it depends on the individual?
Yeah, I think every individual needs to reform themselves. That would be the first thing. But after that, I think it both depends on what kind of individual you are, and what kind of individual you're talking to is even more important. So what is your audience? So, there's a hadith that, to talk to people to the level of their understanding, or the capacity of their understanding. You see that in the Prophet's life also, that, he would speak to different people differently. So that, I think that's kind of, it's normal thing to do. And there might be somebody who really, I think a lot of people nowadays need this intellectual dimension. And that if they have that, their their practice, their conviction, everything would become stronger. This is my experience. I feel like that's what. But there might be some people that you just need to do the old tablighi way, you know.
Hello, assalamu alaikum. So you said there are three divisions of surrendering or in being religious. You said
Yes.
there's first off Islam, which is the action. Then you have the Iman, which is the faith or the belief, and then you have the Ihsan. So my question is, wouldn't Iman and Ihsan be the same thing as you're imagining or you're trying to envision God? What does one do to be spiritual? Like what does one do? Try to imagine God, like try to envision him? What do you do? How do you do step 3, which is Ihsan? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, no, so they are not the same thing, right? So Iman has to do with having so what you're saying, imagining, I mean, if you use it in a more traditional sense of having a sense of these things, having conviction of these things, of the ghaib, right, of the unseen. It has largely to do, though, with the mind, of understanding this, even in a very deep level, but it's really understanding with the mind, right? So with the aql. While, aql is a little bit more than mind, but we won't go there right now. But the ihsan has to do with, one can say, knowing these things with the heart. Knowing with the mind and knowing with the heart are two different things. Knowing with the mind is like knowing something which is external to you, right? You see an apple, so Imam Ghazali, for example, talks about this in his Munkid min al-Dalal, in this kind of spiritual autobiography, that there's different ways of approaching something. So you can, for example, if you have an apple, right? So somebody could give you a description of an apple. That's one. I'm relating something he says here to the example. He doesn't give the apple example, but you've never seen the apple. Somebody tells you, believe them, or something like that. That's one level. A second level is you see the apple, you don't see, but you have never eaten the apple. Maybe you examine it a lot with your mind. You could even be a scientist, right? You cut the apple, you analyze it, you put it under the microscope. You've never eaten it. So, but you can understand a lot about the apple. But you don't really know what an apple is until you eat it. So that's the difference between Iman and Ihsan. Ihsan is eating the apple. So if that sounds still a little abstract, that's why Imam Ghazali calls it dhawq, taste, right? So this third dimension is about experience. It's about really living these things, not just thinking about Allah, not just doing actions that please Allah Ta'ala, although those are all very important things, but really being in the presence of Allah Ta'ala, being in the experiencing something of the divine. And that's why, generally speaking, the way to do that, for example, we were talking about Maulana Thanvi. He says, you need to find a sheikh or a spiritual teacher of some kind. And the way to do that would be to develop one's character, purify one's self, have some kind of emptiness, so that one could, because normally, for example, we live in the world of our thoughts, our fears, our anxieties, whatever's going on in our heads, whatever our memories and so forth. So spiritual practice takes us to a place where, instead of being obsessed or embroiled in our normal nafs, we are able to experience something of emptiness where Allah Ta'ala can make His grace or even His self present in some way to us. So it's really, the third has to do with spiritual experience, with spiritual practice, and therefore involves, one can start on one's own, but ultimately would involve something, take some kind of teacher or something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Also, it's at the end you said that in the modern age you have this lack of knowledge, determination, and also that there's this ignorance that no one really wants to understand anything. So another question is that